Welcome back, friends. I know it's been a hot minute since I've dropped a video. I think this is maybe my third video. And I had planned to talk about something completely different today, but some what I consider exciting news for workers in the United States has dropped, and I wanted to share what I've looked up about it. Now, I've mentioned salaried versus hourly employees in the past, and I did finally research what the history of salaried work is. So, when the Fair Labor Standards Act introduced salaried employment versus hourly employment, it was designed to protect wages regardless of quantity or quality of work, aka you cannot be docked for like slow days. And as I was reading about it, I learned quite a bit that a salaried employee is specifically basically your white collar executives, administrative employees, computer employees have been updated to be specifically mentioned. So like your IT group and quote professionals. And I say quote professionals because we're all professionals. We work in professions. But be that as may, that's how the rule is written. And so it had some unintended consequences of creating basically two tiers of employees. And I did find it interesting. You cannot negotiate with your employer whether you are an hourly or salaried employee. So that's interesting. If your position is considered salaried, it's considered salaried. And you cannot negotiate that. So when the Fair Labor Standards Act was initiated in 1938, it established 40-hour work week, an 8-hour day, and 1.5 times your pay overtime if you work over that 40 hours or over that 8 hours for hourly employees. I cannot find anywhere where a minimum wage was established back then for salaried employees. I saw one blip for pre-2004 and now I can't find it and I can't find anything to support it. So we're going to assume before 2004 there wasn't a legally established minimum wage for salaried employees. In 2004, however, they did establish a minimum. $455 a week, which is approximately $23,663 a year. If you ask me, that's still criminally low. We know how I feel about wages in the US being suppressed. And then there's a whole section on highly compensated individuals, which was, I don't even remember what it was for pre-2004. I think it was over $100,000. I haven't really been able to tell like what that means for people, so we're just going to work with what it means for the bulk of us. So 2004, that was your salary. It did only allow for those highly compensated individuals making over 100,000 to include non-discretionary bonuses, and that means that they're guaranteed bonuses, not, well, if we do well, you'll get a bonus, and incentives, so commissions. So in 2004, those could make up 10% of highly compensated individuals' pay, but nobody else's. In 2019, they raised the salaried minimum to $35,500 a year and began to allow that non-discretionary bonuses and incentives to make up to 10% of those wages for everybody who was considered salaried. They just dropped a new rule, and it will take effect July 1st, 2024. You have to make $844 a week or $43,888 a year to be considered salaried. If you do not make that, they either have to give you a raise until you hit that minimum, or they have to make your position an hourly wage position. Which means then, if you work over 40 hours a week, you get paid for it with overtime. So this is big news. This is really good because $35,000 a year, and then they're working you 80 hours a week, 60 hours, 50 hours, doesn't matter. That's ridiculous. Let's see. 35, 568. That's the 2019 levels. My 2080. That's $17 an hour. So at $17.10 an hour, if you're only working 40 hours, that's what that's what your wage would be if they made you a salaried employee at $35,500. Well, if you're working more than 40 hours, you're making less than $17 an hour. Yeah. Now at 43,000, divided by 2080. Now it's $21 an hour. Now this rule that they just dropped, so they've got the July 2024 levels. In July 2025, you have to make $1,128 a week, which is $58,656,000 a year. So 58,500. And in 2027, it is to be determined by applying the available data to the methodology they used. And they finally established that it has to be refreshed every 3 years. So way back when they wrote this rule, the goal of it was to protect wages and not, oh, it's a slow week, everybody go home, you don't get paid. Which is still an issue for hourly employees, don't get me wrong. But the idea was, well, if you're this highly trained, knowledgeable, executive individual, they don't want you quitting your job because you can't get the hours. So the idea was to protect your wages and say, look, here, this is your salary. This is what you make for the year, period. Slow week, doesn't matter. Heavy week, doesn't matter. And of course, employers only took that the one direction. Oh, well, it's a heavy week. Too bad you're salaried. Oh, it's a slow week. Here, let me give you some of this other work that we need to pawn off on somebody. Instead of hiring somebody, we're just going to give it to you because you can't work less than 40 hours. That's unacceptable. So that's kind of the historical background, and you can read about all of this. I like Wikipedia, but it's not really the end all of all, I would say. But let's go here. So this is the Department of Labor Department of Labor website. I don't know why I didn't grab. You see that? So it's the Department of Labor website. discussing the final rule for restoring and extending overtime protections. And here's the levels that they just established. But what's cool is they have an FAQ. Does it address keeping the earnings threshold up to date? Yes, which is great. So the calculation they use is current data, earnings data using the most recent available 4 quarters of data. So they're using basically current period data to determine like what wages are. What's interesting is they estimate 4 million workers who are currently exempt under levels right now will be entitled to overtime protection or a great big raise. And that's pretty cool. 4 million workers can begin to either start expecting overtime pay or a raise in order to maintain their exempt status. I cannot tell you how excited I am for this. And I mentioned it to my sister. And of course, we both wondered how employers are going to try and find their way around this. And the only way I can think that they're going to find their way around it is they're going to make these individuals hourly and then immediately limit them to 40 hours. I don't see how that is a negative, because if you are currently under these thresholds and you're working 80 hours a week, it's basically a raise if you can now only work 40 hours a week. You got 40 hours of your week back. It's a big deal. If you're working 50 hours, 60 hours, that's 10, 20 hours of your week back that you didn't have because you were working so many hours. So I still consider it a win. Even if your wage doesn't change, but you're now limited to 40 hours a week, hooray. Hooray. So I found this very, very exciting. Maybe I'm the only one, but I thought I would share. I think it's a big deal. And I found a lot. So at one point I thought there's all sorts of, this is directly from the Fair Labor Standards Board, Department of Labor, descriptions about what counts as a salaried employee, what counts what exemptions they can use, what counts as a highly compensated worker. It talks about police and first responders, which generally they're usually unionized. So I feel like there might not be a whole lot of effect there. I did not read much about that, but that being said, so this is super exciting for workers, like super exciting for workers. I think there's been a lot of effort to get wages back into the hands of the wage earners, us, and away from executives who, without us, have nothing, really. So that's exciting. Other exciting news this week is the FTC announced a rule banning non-compete agreements. So currently, a lot of jobs require individuals to sign a non-compete agreement, which means they cannot work at another business in that industry. So your options are stay put and probably not get raises and not be able to negotiate a new wage with a new employer, or leave the industry. And the FTC said no. Non-compete agreements, I think, when they were initially established, were designed for like high-level execs who could leave a company, start their own, and just tank their prior company because they knew all the secrets. They knew all the customers. They could take all the customers with them. And this rule that the FTC announced does not, they're not just leaving the employers high and dry. You can still have a non-disclosure agreement, and for senior executives, existing non-competes will remain in force, but there will not be any new non-competes allowed. And I don't know where they got these numbers, but the FTC estimates the banning non-competes will result in reduced healthcare costs of 74 to 194 billion. I don't know how, but okay. New business formation, 2.7% increase in the rate of new firm formation, resulting in over 8,500 additional new businesses created each year. A rise in innovation, an average of 17,000 to 29,000 more patents each year for the next 10 years. This reflects an estimated increase of about 3,000 to 5,000 new patents in the first year non-competes are banned, rising to about 30,000 to 53,000 in the 10th year, which is fascinating because also a non-compete. Okay, so you've got this really cool idea, but you signed a non-compete agreement, so you can't even do it on your own time because it competes with what your employer does. But they're not going to pay you extra for it. It was your idea, but you belong to the company. And so the company's going to take that patent. So there's no incentive for employees to create new things. And higher worker earnings. So the FTC estimates higher workings of $400 to $488 billion in increased wages for workers over the next decade. And I believe we talked about this in a prior video where workers who regularly change positions see a 50% higher wage over the life of their employment than somebody who stays put. Well, if you've got a non-compete agreement in force, you're more likely to stay put because you can't go to a competitor and get a higher wage. With this ban of non-competes, that's no longer an issue. Now, I did read that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does intend to sue over this rule. They feel that if the FTC can issue regulations with respect to unfair methods of competition, they flat admit it's unfair methods of competition in their statement, then there's no aspect of the U.S. economy they couldn't regulate. I understand overregulation is not necessarily the answer, but these employers have proven that if they are not regulated, they will take every advantage that they can of workers. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's statement, and that was a direct quote, isn't really looking real slick for them. Like it's not looking real classy, y'all. So I think I don't know how the trial, if they even make it to trial, would go. I have no idea how the courts will rule on that. I mean, I can take a guess based on how some things have been going recently, but I want to remain optimistic. We'll see. The fact that the Fair Labor Standards Act and the FTC both kind of took a big 1-2 punch at businesses this week is exciting and surprising. I was a little surprised to see both of these hit right at the same time. I think they're long overdue. And the FTC, in regards to the non-competes, I think is just finally responding to the fact that employees have been horribly hamstrung by non-compete agreements. I can't even imagine, as an accountant, having to sign a non-compete agreement. I couldn't go anywhere. Everybody, like, I immediately have to leave the industry. I could never change jobs again. I can't even imagine what it's like for people who are in any of the sciences or any of the tech or manufacturing, any of those industries where, oh, you work with this type of machinery, you're really good, you build these types of programs, you can't work for anybody else who does anything remotely like this because you could become a competitor. Well, if your stuff is good enough, your competition shouldn't matter. Right? Competition's good for the soul. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. We'll talk about that misused quote later, and then you'll find why I think it's so funny. So I'm pleased. I'm pleased with what has happened this week. And a lot of employers are probably going to complain about how much money that these things are going to cost them. But labor is one of your costs. If you cannot stay afloat without paying your wages crappy, or your employees terrible, crappy wages, then you're not a viable business. Sorry, you either outgrew yourself or you have bloated expenses elsewhere, exec pay. And so if you cannot pay your people good wages, you have no business being in business. There, I said it. Either you're too big or you're too bloated. So that's how I feel about it. And I have absolutely zero sympathy for these employers. Zero. And if you can't afford a little healthy competition, same thing. Well, then your whatever you're producing must be not as good as you think it is. if the only way you can get people to buy it is to not have any competition. Still not feeling sorry for you. Tell me what you think, and tell me, I would love to know if any of you that are watching this video are affected by the rule. And then I want to hear in July how your employer dealt with it. I would love to hear if you want to share. You don't have to share publicly. If you want to share with me privately, or if you don't want to share at all, that's okay too. But if you're willing to share, I would love to hear how your employer is dealing with this. I worked for a city. There was a rule, they had attempted to do this a few years ago and it died. I think it got challenged in court and it died. And the city I worked for was panicking because they owned 2 golf courses and their golf pros made under what the new salary threshold was going to be. And they were panicking that they were going to have to either give these guys a big raise or pay them overtime. And they, in the summer, were working like 80 hours a week. And they were just in a panic about it. I really didn't have any sympathy, and I was horrified to learn at what those poor guys made back then for what the amount of work that they did. I was appalled. So, and that's where I used to think that in order to be salaried, you were supposed to be management or have people report to you. I thought that was part of the rule, at least originally. Turns out that is not. That was a policy where I worked. And so if you didn't have individuals who reported to you, you were not salaried. So I was not salaried, even though I was a professional worker, because of the city's policy. So I would get paid overtime if I worked over 40 hours. They were very stingy about over 40 hours. I was not complaining. I want to do my job in my 40-hour work week and go home. So that's everything for today. I know it's a relatively short video, I hope. And just tell me what you think. Tell me what you think. Tell me if it affects you. I'd love to hear from you.